The land woke before the people did. It always had in the soft blue hour before morning decided what kind of day it would be. The grass leaned east as if listening for a voice that had once sung to it. Dust drifted low, unbothered, settling into the shallow places where rain used to pause. Somewhere between the last star and the first bird call, a child stood alone. She was 5 years old, though the number meant little to her. Time had never been gentle enough to teach her how to count it properly. Her feet were bare and toughened, the soles already knowing stone and thorn. Her hair fell dark and tangled down her back, cut unevenly by necessity rather than care. Her eyes were the kind that watched first and trusted later, if at all. The wind circled her, curious. It brushed her thin dress. It tugged at her sleeves. It tried, in its quiet way, to move her along. But she did not move. She had learned early that stillness could be a form of survival. When you stayed quiet long enough, the world sometimes forgot to harm you. When you became small enough, even grief could pass over without stopping. Behind her, there was nothing to return to. No fire ring still warm. No voice calling her name. Her people had faded from her life the way footprints fade after a storm, not erased all at once, but softened day by day until even memory had trouble holding their shape. Sickness had come first. Hunger had followed. Then the long walk that never seemed to end. By the time the walking stopped, there was no one left to tell her where home had gone. So she stood where the land placed her, near the edge of a white settlement, though not inside it. Close enough to smell cooked food when the wind was kind. Far enough away to remain unseen when doors opened and closed. People passed her without truly seeing her. A shadow among shadows, an Apache child shaped by loss, carrying silence like a second skin. Once, a man noticed her. He was not old, not cruel in the way stories warned about. Just restless, just tired of his own narrow life. He saw her crouched near the edge of town, watching the butcher's door as if it might open for her if she stared long enough. On impulse, not intention, he tossed her a piece of bread. It landed in the dust. She waited before touching it, counted breaths the way fear had taught her. When nothing happened, she reached out, her fingers closing around the food with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. For a moment, something flickered in her chest. Hope, thin as a thread, but real. She returned the next day, and the next. This time, when he saw her, his face hardened. Whatever kindness had surprised him before now felt like a responsibility he did not want. He told her to go. Not loudly. Not with anger. That was worse. He turned his back while she was still standing there, holding the memory of bread that would not be offered again. She learned something important then, that the first hand extended is not always the one meant to hold you. Others existed at the edges of her world. A frontier woman who left scraps behind a shed after dark, but never stayed long enough to meet her eyes. An old trader who once shook his head and muttered that children like her disappeared all the time, as if saying it gently might make it less true. Night came quietly. The desert cooled. Exhaling heat it had held all day. The sky stretched wide and indifferent, stars scattered like secrets that had been kept too long. The girl wandered until her legs shook. When she could go no farther, she collapsed into tall grass just beyond the reach of town light. The stalks bent around her, not unkindly. She curled inward, making herself small, pressing one hand into the soil. The earth was warm, still alive. She did not cry. Tears required energy she could not spare. Instead, she breathed. Slow, shallow, counting heartbeats the way she counted everything else that mattered. If she stayed still enough, perhaps the night would pass without noticing her. The wind returned, softer now. It moved through the grass like a lullaby without words. It lifted her hair, traced her cheek, tested her resolve. Still, she remained. The land did not reject her. It did not save her either. It simply allowed her to stay. By morning, dew clung to her dress, and the horizon burned pale gold. The girl opened her eyes to a world that had not ended in the night. She stood again, 5 years old, alone, unburied, and though she did not know it yet, something in the soil had already begun to remember her. Morning arrived without announcement, no trumpet of light, no sudden warmth. Just a slow softening of the world, as if the land itself were stretching awake, beyond the last line of the settlement, where voices thinned and fences lost their nerve. A small ranch rested in quiet agreement with the earth. It was not large. It did not boast. The ground there looked worked, but not wounded, as if each furrow had been asked before it was opened. The man who lived there rose before the sun finished deciding its shape. He was in his mid-30s, though his face carried years that had nothing to do with age. Wind had written its name across his skin. Loss had etched its own quieter marks. His movements were unhurried, not because life had been easy, but because rushing had never improved anything worth keeping. He spoke little. When he did, it was usually to animals. Or to the land. Not over it. Never over it, he knelt often. To mend a fence post that leaned too hard. To press seeds into soil with his thumb rather than a tool. To listen. People who passed by sometimes mistook this for weakness. They had never stayed long enough to notice how the land answered him back. That morning, as the light crept low across the fields, he noticed something small near the edge of his property. A shape that did not belong to rock or weed or shadow. A child. She stood still, as if movement might break her. Her dress was thin, her feet bare, her eyes fixed on him with a watchfulness far older than her 8 or 9 years. He did not approach, he did not speak. Instead, he knelt where he was and turned his attention to a cracked irrigation line. He worked slowly, deliberately, letting his presence be seen without making it loud. The land was his excuse, and he was grateful for it. The girl watched. She had learned the danger of men who noticed too quickly, of voices that reached for you before they understood you were fragile. This one did neither. When he finished, he stood and stepped back, leaving a small bundle on a rock nearby. Food, water, placed as if it belonged to the morning, not as an offering that demanded acceptance. Then he walked away. She waited a long time after he was gone before she moved. Her legs trembled as she crossed the space between fear and hunger. She took the food and retreated into the tall grass beyond his fields, watching for consequences that did not come. The next day, she returned, as so did he. Their routine grew without words. He left food without watching her eat. She helped without being asked, pulling weeds with small hands that knew the shape of work. If she disappeared for days, he did not search. If she returned, he did not question. Trust, he understood, was not something you demanded. It was something you made room for. Others noticed. Eventually, a neighboring rancher laughed when he saw her, said things about savages and strays, and how kindness only invited trouble. A traveling preacher warned him that people talked, that a man alone should be careful about what he let linger near his land. That he listened politely. Then he returned to his fields. The girl learned his rhythms. The way he paused before sunrise. The way he touched the soil before planting. The way he never raised his voice, even when things went wrong. One evening, exhausted from carrying water she had insisted on hauling herself, she fell asleep near the barn. The ground was cool, the air gentle. She dreamed of nothing. That he found her there as the light faded. For a long moment, he only stood, unsure if waking her would frighten her more than leaving her exposed. Finally, he fetched a blanket and laid it over her with care, careful not to let his hands linger. She did not wake. For the first time since the world had emptied itself of people who claimed her, the girl slept through the night without fear of being moved. The land held its breath. Something fragile had been allowed to stay. Time did not pass the way it did in town. It moved differently on that land. It came like seasons do, unannounced but certain, leaving traces rather than scars. Summers burned and softened. Winters thinned the fields and tested what had been planted. Between them all, the girl grew to be. By the time she reached her late teens, her body carried the quiet strength of someone who had learned endurance without bitterness. Her hands were capable, scarred in small places, steady even when the wind rose. Her hair she kept tied back when she worked, loose only when the day was done. Her eyes still held watchfulness, but now there was space in them too, room enough for something new. The man grew older as well, though his change was slower. Gray touched his temples. His steps were a little more careful. Yet his presence remained the same, steady, unclaimed by hurry, shaped by patience. They worked side by side without instruction, without praise. Morning found them in the fields. Evening settled them near the fire, where silence became something shared rather than endured. Sometimes they spoke of small things, the weather, the soil, which plants had taken better than expected. Other times, Words felt unnecessary. She began to talk more as the years unfolded. Not all at once. Not in confessions. Just fragments. A memory here. A feeling there. He never interrupted. Never corrected her understanding of her own past. That, more than anything, taught her safety. That I in town, eyes followed her. Whispers grew teeth. Some called her lucky. Others called her something worse. She learned to keep her gaze forward, her shoulders squared, carrying the weight of judgment she had not earned. Inside her, a question grew. Was she only something passing through? A kindness extended too long? A mistake that time had not yet corrected? One evening, as the sun lowered itself into amber and shadows stretched across the fields, she spoke the words she had carried alone for years, not as a demand, not as a plea for possession. She spoke of soil, of seeds that fall on ground people believe is ruined, of how some places look empty only because no one stayed long enough to tend them. She asked him, quietly, if something shaped by loss could still be planted, if it could grow roots deep enough to remain when the wind returned. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did. He did not answer right away. That he watched the field instead. The way young shoots held themselves upright despite the weight of dust. The way the land responded when given patience rather than forced. He told her that planting was never a promise. It was an act of faith. That nothing was guaranteed, but some things were worth the waiting anyway. Night came with a storm. Thunder rolled low and heavy, not violent, just insistent. Rain followed, soaking the earth, darkening the soil until it smelled alive again. She stood in it, letting it wash over her, unsure if she had revealed too much, unsure if the land would accept what she had finally dared to name. He joined her without pulling her away. They stood side by side as the rain fell. Two lives shaped by waiting, sharing the quiet knowledge that growth never announced itself when it began. The land drank deeply, and somewhere beneath the surface, roots took hold. The land remembered everything. That it remembered footsteps taken gently, and those pressed down in anger. It remembered hands that had asked before taking. It remembered the girl who had once slept in its grass and the man who had knelt beside it long before anyone thought to watch. When trouble came, it did not arrive like a gunshot. That it came like rumors do, slow, persistent, impossible to ignore. Men from town began to talk about boundaries, about papers and claims, and who truly belonged where. The land, they said, was valuable now, worth more than silence, worth more than patience. The first man returned with them. Time had not been kind to him. His shoulders sloped inward now, his eyes hollowed by choices made too quickly and kindnesses withheld too long. He spoke loudly, as if volume could cover regret. He looked at the young woman, no longer a child, no longer invisible, and said her name wrong. That he said she owed him something, that he had seen her first. The old ache stirred in her chest, but it did not take hold. She had learned the difference between being noticed and being known. The rancher did not step forward in anger. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood beside her. That was the moment the town felt shift, not because of threat, but because of certainty. He spoke plainly. About years of work. About tending land without bleeding it dry. About how some things did not need ownership to be defended. He spoke of her not as someone taken in, not as someone rescued, but as someone who had chosen to stay. The men listened. Some scoffed. Some looked at the fields and saw the truth written there in green and gold. The land had flourished. Paper could not argue with that. When they left, the silence felt different. Lighter, as if something old had finally loosened its grip. Seasons passed again. The ranch endured. The fields widened. Children's laughter eventually found its way into the mornings, light-footed and fearless. The woman watched them run where she once hid, her hand resting in the soil that had held her when nothing else would. She understood now what she had asked all those years ago. That he be planted was not to be owned. That it was to be trusted. He be given time. The man grew older still, his steps slower, his hands rough but steady. They shared quiet evenings, the kind that did not need explanation. Love, she learned, was not loud. It was consistent. It showed up. It stayed. One evening, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, she stood alone at the edge of the field. The wind came again. That it moved through the grass the way it always had. Curious, testing, remembering. This time, it did not try to carry her away. She was rooted, Some lives are not broken. They are simply waiting for Kindersoiled. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who waited to be seen, take a moment to like this story, leave a comment, tell us where you are watching from, and remember, even the quietest beginnings can grow something that lasts.